broader level is my friend Russ Latino, who's the president of Empower Mississippi, and who's here with us in studio. Good morning, Russ.
Thanks for having me, buddy.
Absolutely.
Some great thoughts this morning.
Well, you're kind to say that. I hope you got a lot of good wisdom on how to wait to fill up your car until the last second there. So.
I was talking about the inflation commentary, but I also am very guilty of that.
It just always feels like you're on the phone, you're doing work, you're making progress in the car, and you think, I don't have time to stop at the gas station.
You're just busy.
Yeah, that's
right?
exactly
There are bigger things to do than remember where you put your keys or whether or not there's gas in the car.
That's exactly right. Doesn't always work out for the best. So.
Sure.
Well, thank you for being here with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's, as you know, the fair's going on right now. Tomorrow and Thursday, we've got the political speaking, and this is kind of the kickoff to the 23 statewide elections when we'll elect all of our statewide offices. Are you paying pretty close attention to all that?
We are. It's funny. I've often kind of thought of Neshoba as something that would make for a really great political thriller if somebody was going to write a book.
Yeah.
It's just such a surreal setting. You're covered in red clay. You're dripping buckets of sweat. There's like all of these different movers and shakers all around you. I think it could make for some interesting fiction if John Grisham is listening.
Which he should be.
Yeah, surely. But yes, we're obviously paying attention. I mean, for a lot of people, they will tell you the best part of Neshoba is not the speeches, right? It's the camaraderie sitting around on the porch. It's the food. It's the races, all of that, the great music. But for politicos, it's kind of interesting to hear what people are going to say. My sense, Lucien, moving into 2023 is we're actually not going to see a ton of movement. Every year before an election, there's always this rumor mill about who's going to run against who and all of this intrigue. And at the end of the day, it normally falls out so that incumbents run unopposed. And then, people are sort of jockeying for position for once that person is termed out.
Right.
So I suspect that's where we're going with one possible exception.
Where's the exception? Top of the ticket or somewhere else?
I don't think it's the top of the ticket. I don't. I mean, certainly there have been rumors about the top of the ticket. Right. I think that if you look at what's going on social media, that there appears to be a campaign building for the lieutenant governor's race.
And this would be Chris McDaniel and obviously against Elbert Hosemann.
That's my sense.
Yeah. Going to start in the governor's race, I mean, I think there's, to your point, nobody wants to write a political piece that talks about how everything's going to be totally boring and unopposed because nobody's going to read 750 words about how anybody's going to cruise to re-election, except maybe the candidate themselves.
Right.
But I know a lot of people will be watching there's been a lot of rumors about Philip Gunn potentially running for governor. The way the speech schedule is set up, I think Speaker Gunn speaks immediately before Governor Reeves, and so I assume there will be a lot of people at Founders Square listening intently to see what Speaker Gunn has to say.
Yeah, I would imagine that there have been a lot of rumors to that. I've not seen anything external that would suggest that that's actually happening. For my part, I mean, I think the governor's doing a great job. I think the speaker does a phenomenal job in his chamber. I think, candidly, the three sort of titular heads of Delbert in the Senate, Philip in the House, and Tate have the potential to do an awful lot going into the next 4 years. And so my hope is that they figure out how to maximize the opportunity that they've got.
Yeah. I tend to agree with you, and I think I completely agree that it would certainly be better for partisan politics if we didn't have a lot of primaries. Now, obviously, you can disagree about who the right office holder ought to be in any of these offices, but it certainly advantages the party if you don't have opposition.
Yeah, and look, I've got no problem with an incumbent challenge. Candidly, I think that's sort of the heartbeat of a democracy is when you don't allow power to become stagnant and complacent. I think that's a little different, though, when you're dealing with a situation where you look at it and say, if these guys were able to get along really well, they could accomplish some really big things for the state. And if they're, infighting, then you're going to accomplish a heck of a lot less.
That's right.
And as somebody who identifies as conservative, who has voted Republican his entire life, I want to see the Republican leadership in this state thrive because it's the only way that the state of Mississippi is going to thrive.
Amen. We were talking a little bit about it, or I was talking a little bit about it before. I mean, that's why so many of us have worked so hard, I know you very much have, to get us to this point where we basically control everything. And we control everything, at least legislatively, in such a big way, it ought to be, if there is a conservative piece of legislation, it happens. It ought not get caught up. I mean, obviously people can disagree about the details, but in terms of principles, we ought to be able to get it all done.
I think we've seen this in D.C. quite a bit, Lucien, where most elected officials, and I'm not putting this on the Mississippi legislature, but certainly on Congress, they really don't want to be controversial. If there's a way to do something that they can put out a press release and it kind of quenches the thirst for something that responds to a cultural outrage, as an example, they'll do that. But when it comes to hard policy, where you've got diametrically opposite sides trying to figure out how do we make this work, most of them, given the choice, would say, let's just avoid the controversy of taking it on at all. And I think we've got to fight that urge in the state to make sure that, hey, if we've got Republican supermajorities and a Republican governor, we should be able to accomplish some really conservative things. One of those things that you mentioned earlier, I mean, we're the most regulated state in the Southeast.
Which is crazy.
Which is crazy. I lived in Virginia for a couple of years, and I joked when I moved back that in a lot of ways the business climate in Virginia was way better than the business climate in Mississippi, because even though they're a purple state with some liberal tendencies, when it came to business, there weren't as many strings attached. And so I do think Mississippi has the potential to go a long way in creating that environment for growth, but it involves being willing to gore some oxes and be willing to stand up for something, and hopefully we'll get there.
Talk a little bit more about that, because I know I was saying it just before you got on. I just think that needs to be the people who are in elected office in our state every day ought to be waking up and figuring out what are the things we can fix that will improve Mississippi as a place to have a business, grow a business, start a business, however you want to put it.
Yeah, so I mean, my thought for a long time has been that we should commit to a serious red tape reduction. This model actually didn't even start in the United States, Lucien. It started in British Columbia, where they decided essentially we're over-regulating the heck out of businesses and individuals. Instead of trying to go through and do this piecemeal, what we're going to commit to is a 30% reduction in regulatory requirements. So anytime it says must or shall, as a state, we're going to commit to a 30% reduction over the next 3 years. But they did it in an interesting way. They didn't go and tell the people running agencies, here's what you're going to cut. They went and made them partners. They said, look, we're going to support you in streamlining your processes and building new processes to replace the antiquated, and we're not going to treat you as an enemy. The end result was a 42% reduction in regulatory requirements in 3 years.
Wow.
So something like that, a big, audacious goal, to me, is the right approach to start this thing rolling.
That's awesome. I hope we can talk more about it after the break. This is Lucien Smith here in for Paul Gallo on the Gallo Radio Show on SuperTalk, Mississippi. Good morning, everybody. This is Lucien Smith in for Paul Gallo here on the Gallo Radio Show on SuperTalk, Mississippi. Coming to you live from the Trustmark Bank studio. Life's beautiful when your bank fits you to a T. Trustmark, people you trust, advice that works. To learn more, go to trustmark.com, member FDIC. Well, with us in studio is still Russ Latino, the president of Empower Mississippi, talking a little bit about how the future looks politically and how we can do some things as a result of the future politics to help move the state forward. Russ, we were talking a little bit about how the possibility of a primary challenge to the lieutenant governor, and I've heard the same rumors you have, that Senator McDaniel's out there talking about it and trying to position himself to the right of the lieutenant governor. I'm curious, do you have a sense of, is that something we're going to hear an announcement about soon, or you think that's a little ways off?
Yeah, I don't have any inside information on that. All I would say is I know there's a draft page up on Facebook, and generally you don't have draft ex-politician without the politician being willing to be draft.
Amen.
And so to me, there's a fairly strong indicator that he's running. And to his credit, there'll be a lot of thoughts here. He has never been afraid of taking on a big fight.
No doubt about that. No doubt about that.
So we'll see how it unfolds. I don't have any sort of inside knowledge of when an announcement could be, or what it's going to look like, or what the messaging is, or anything like that. I think it'll make for fascinating politics,
no doubt.
Which is cool if you're one of those people that likes to watch fascinating politics. I do think, though, that, sort of as a conservative movement in the state and as Republicans, there tends to be this sense of invincibility that I see from time to time that I think is destructive. For a long time, Democrats in this state felt invincible,
right,
until they weren't. I can remember George H.W. Bush's first term, where people were saying there will never be another Democrat president. We were coming off the Reagan Revolution. Everybody was on board with that, and suddenly you have this smooth-talking, charismatic guy from Arkansas come in and lay wood, right? And so we should not be in a place where we think we can be lazy and not responsive to what people want. And so I think it's good that we have, from time to time contests that remind us of the importance of moving the ball.
I agree. Yeah, when I was chairman of the party, I'd have people come up to me a lot of times who were mad at one elected official or the other. They would say, well, you got to go talk to so-and-so and tell them they got to be more conservative. And, the party as an institution doesn't really have the authority to do that. All they can do is run fair primaries. And what I kept reminding people is, I can't do that, but you can. If you think somebody is inadequately conservative, go find someone who is more conservative, run them, and beat the person you think is inadequately conservative. That's the way you move people to the right. And I agree with you. I'm certainly not suggesting anyone deserves a primary challenger. I'm not getting into that, but I do think as a general rule, primaries have they tend to push people to the right in the Republican Party because that's where your opportunity to get beaten is more often than not.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And I think you're also right. I think it's important. You did see the Democrats in Mississippi at one point be totally invincible, at least in their own mind, and then little by little we whittled that away, and now. You have to work pretty hard to find a significant Democratic office holder. There are a few, but you got to look pretty hard to find them.
It's interesting. I did a debate that I moderated a few years back for a seat in the legislature. And there were 5 or 6 candidates. They all did a fine job. But I started the debate by saying, essentially, raise your hand if you're pro-Second Amendment, and everybody raised their hand. Raise your hand if you're pro-life. Everybody raised their hand. And I basically said, good, we're not going to talk about those things.
Right.
Because we've established the baseline that everyone here is those things. Let's talk about how we expand opportunity for Mississippians. And I think the legislature, to its credit, has done a lot to defend our natural rights. It's done a lot to make sure that we're living in a state that recognizes the dignity of life. But at some level, the most pressing thing facing our state is there the kind of economic opportunity that people want to move to or stay in and feel like they can thrive? And to do that, there's some boring stuff, but the boring stuff is arguably the most important stuff that they can take on. Things like regulations. Obviously the tax reform that got passed this past session was a big step forward. I think there's more that they can do in the tax arena, Lucien. I think full expensing is something that the state should be looking at, which everybody just said, what the heck is that? It basically means if you're investing in a business, you're not paying taxes on the investments that you're making in a business. It encourages capital expense that allows for the growth of the economy. And so those sorts of things are the kinds of things that makes people's eyes glaze over, but it's also the kind of thing that makes the environment great so that you do have cultural things that you can go take advantage of as a family. You do have a thriving community. And so those are the kinds of things that I think the legislature should target now, given the fact that we've done what we need to do to sort of preserve the natural rights on things like gun rights and being pro-life.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think we also, we have the ability to walk and chew gum at the same time. To the extent that there's the need for additional protection of life, additional protection of our Second Amendment rights, I'm for it. But I think the legislature should have the ability, and I think they do have the ability, both to protect natural rights and to advance the things that bring more opportunity. And talk about that for a second, because you and I have talked about this both on and off the air. To me, the single most important thing now that we have control of the legislature, supermajority control of the governor's office, is what can we do to expand economic opportunity in the state? Because I think doing that solves all sorts of problems that aren't obviously related to the economy. So, if you're king for the day, what should be the major focuses the next couple of years?
Yeah, so I would move and keep moving towards the elimination of the income tax. You look at the 9 states that don't have one; they're all not only kicking Mississippi's tail, they're kicking the nation's tail in terms of immigration of population, in terms of GDP growth, in terms of wages. Across the board, they're doing better than states that do have the income tax. It makes a lot of sense because you're no longer disincentivizing work and productivity is how economies grow and opportunities present themselves. So that's one. Two, I would come out and say we're going to do a 30% reduction in all regulatory requirements of the state. We're going to make agencies our partners in this process. We're going to do it in a fixed period of time, similar to what I described that British Columbia did so successfully, because a lot of the real pain in the economy or the drag on the economy comes from stuff that average people don't ever see, but that businesses have to deal with. I think the other thing I'd say is that we have to decide whether or not we think the primary purpose of education is preparing kids for life. Because if we believe that the primary purpose of education is to prepare kids for life, we need to give teachers more resources at the local level, more freedom at the local level to be able to innovate in the classroom and respond to what their students need versus trying to do it from a top-down approach.
Amen.
And then we need to give families options. And I don't understand to this day why that's such a difficult concept for folks in Mississippi. And really, it's not even folks in Mississippi. If you look at the polling, 80+% of the population thinks that parents should have choices, that money should follow the student. For some reason, it's just really controversial in a couple square blocks in the middle of Jackson. And what I would tell you is if you're a Republican and you're looking at what just happened in Arizona, if you're looking at what just happened in West Virginia, where they allow the money to follow the student now universally, if you look at just what happened in South Carolina, where someone who ran a school choice organization ran for the state superintendent of education against someone that was pro-teacher union, and she shellacked that person by a 2-to-1 margin. Republicans are ready, conservatives are ready, and even beyond that, I think Democrats are ready.
And I think
for
a lot
families
of them
to have more options.
That's right. I think behind closed doors, I think a lot of the elected Democrats would even tell you this is a good idea, but I'm worried about the politics back home.
Sure.
And to my mind, it's a civil rights issue, right? Because people like you or I, we can move to a good school district. We can stroke a check for a private school. That is not true for the overwhelming number of Americans. And to me, it's just an issue of fundamental fairness that we're going to give people the choice to figure out where they want to send their children to school and fund students rather than funding systems. That's what we need to do on the education front, I think.
And look, sometimes I think by people who want to maintain control, the same people who want to have top-down power over schools, tell teachers that this is a threat to you, right? That they're coming after you. The reality is we're not going to have any fewer students to educate. Where they might be educated may be different from family to family, but we're going to need the same number of teachers. And candidly, when you create an environment where there are different types of learning going on, different systems, then that gives a teacher themselves more options to find that environment that works best for them and being able to provide instruction to students. So I think we need to, from a public perspective, get back to the idea that local teachers know best, and we need to trust them and give them the resources they need to operate in the classroom. And then I think, secondly, we've got to recognize that every kid is different. It's not at one school being better than another school. Every kid is different, and families deserve options. And you're right, it's a fundamental fairness issue because I can afford to move somewhere. I can afford a private school. Lots of people can't.
That's right. Russ, you got time for one more segment?
Sure.
Hey, well, look, thanks, Russ. Y'all stick around. We'll hear more from Russ Latino about the future of the state and what we can do to move Mississippi forward and all the good work that Empower does. This is Lucien Smith in for Paul Gallo here on the Gallo Radio Show on SuperTalk Mississippi. Good morning, everybody. This is Lucien Smith in for Paul Gallo here on the Gallo Radio Show on SuperTalk Mississippi. Here with the president of Empower Mississippi, Russ Latino. Russ, we were talking before the break about some of the things that Mississippi can do to expand economic opportunity, and I think that the regulation piece to me is the most interesting because it's the best example, I think, of where a lot of times politics and policy line up pretty well, and I think in the long term, the politics of deregulation, good policy does become good politics. But that strikes me as one where in the short term, you're going to have some hesitation because you have all of these entrenched interests. And so everybody may favor, professional licensing reform until the local barber or hair braider or whomever is protected by this, effectively the state allowing there to be these little economic cartels. When they come to their individual legislator and say, well, you're going to put me out of business, people start going, well, maybe that's not the regulation we need to look at. And I'm just curious to get your thoughts. I mean, how much of that do you think is the reason we're not seeing more of the regulatory reform in the state?
It's a ton. I think, unfortunately, the mindset in Mississippi very frequently is how do we protect what we have?
Right.
Versus how do we grow what we have?
Right.
And so, I mean, I think you see it in lots of different areas pop up, but occupational licensing is certainly one of those areas. And sometimes it's not even should this license exist. Like there could be a legitimate public safety concern as an example, but how do you best regulate, right? How do you make sure that it's narrowly tailored in a way that it doesn't exclude people from being able to find work? And what you often see is that these groups do extend beyond, like, how do we protect public safety, and it becomes how do we protect ourselves from competition. And that's obviously maybe good for the people that are already in the system, but it's really bad for the state.
Right.
It's really bad for people who aren't currently working. I mean, we've got the second lowest workforce participation rate in the country, which is a real problem. We've got a lot of people in the back of the wagon and very few people pulling it, and that's a recipe for disaster. And so I think part of this is breaking this sort of, for lack of a better way to describe it, sort of a TVA Democrat mentality, which is, it's the government's job to protect industry, it's the government's job to protect business. No, it's the government's job to create an atmosphere where businesses can go out, compete, kick butt, and provide good services and products.
Amen.
And so I think that's got to be a shift in mindset if we're ever going to be successful on anything. We've got to go from protectionist to, like, how do we grow? And look, there are signs of that's happening, right? The Occupational License Review Commission is something that I worked on. I think that's got incredible potential if it gets used the right way. Certainly the tax reforms that have happened have been good. A lot of people will say, well, Mississippi's only 46th in this or 44th in that. And that may be true from a national ranking standpoint, but you got to realize we were 50th. Right. So there are signs that we're moving in the right direction in education that I was talking about. When it comes to economic issues, I think for us to really sort of jump the chasm, it's going to take a change of sort of a paradigm shift, change of mindset around what the role of government is with respect to business. It's not just to protect me from having competition.
Right. Monopolies are great when you're the monopolist.
Correct.
But they're not great for all the people who use the services.
Now, I will say, like on CNBC's deal, they're right about the regulatory side of Mississippi. I find it interesting that people keep saying that we're still a jackpot justice state, because I do think the tort reform that you were probably a part of
has made a big difference.
I also think, though, the amount of sort of social engineering that now goes into those rankings.
The whole inclusion category, to me, it was just a way of sort of, shoehorning in the liberal policies they'd prefer.
Correct. And not only is that not the right ranking of whether or not we're business friendly, but it delegitimizes the rest of the study, which actually included some good things. So if you include all of that gobbledygook, if you're someone in Mississippi, you can say, oh, those are just a bunch of progressives. And you miss the fact that there are some legitimate points brought up around regulation.
That's a great point. That's a great point.
Yeah, I am hardened in the sense that I do think philosophically the leadership in the state gets it. I think it's a question of how much can we push the legislature to think about these things differently.
Well, and to my mind, I think that's one of the great things about what Empower does and other similar organizations is, we've got to have some people out there who are pushing the not sexy but crucially important things. I mean, deregulation, nobody shows up at a rally and goes, deregulation! But you've got to have people out there who are pushing it so that legislators and other elected officials, feel that that's something they can do, even if it may not seem facially to be politically popular.
No, I think that's right. And some of it is humanizing this, right? I mean, the idea that somebody like Melanie Armstrong, who came into the state of Mississippi with her husband, who's a pastor, wanted to start her own business, was doing hair braiding and got shut down by the Board of Cosmetology.
Nuts.
We changed that law, and we went from like 2 people in the state doing this to like 400 and now 4,000 people in the state doing this. That may not seem like a lot, but you're talking about 4,000 people who can now provide for their families. Those are the kind of powerful examples when you remove those barriers and see people actually start to be able to provide for themselves.
Well, it's a good change. It's a good start, and I know I am not alone in saying I'm very appreciative of all the work that you and Empower does to help move Mississippi forward. So thanks for taking the time to be with us this morning and talk a little bit about it, Russ.